with Donald Trump's Justice Department indicting former FBI Director James Comey. And not for the first time. This is the second case against Comey after the first attempt collapsed, putting one of Trump's most prominent perceived political enemies firmly back into the spotlight. The New York Times calling it, quote, another twist in the department's tortured efforts to satisfy the demands of Mr. Trump to target Comey, a longtime foe of the president. This charge is over a social media post made nearly 1 year ago of a photograph of seashells arranged to say 8647. 86 is often slang used in places like restaurants for to remove. And Trump is, of course, the 47th president. The DOJ is claiming Comey did, quote, knowingly and willfully make a threat to take the life of and to inflict bodily harm upon Trump by posting that image, citing a statute that criminalizes threats to the president. The indictment comes as acting AG Todd Blanche, currently helming the DOJ, has been making splashy moves to permanently get that top job. Blanche answering questions about free speech versus true threats.
For critics who say, where does free speech end and an actual threat of violence begin?
I don't know what critics say that, especially today, but it's not a very difficult line to look at, and it's not, in my mind, a difficult line for one to cross over one way or the other. And so whether there is a defense, as you just described, maybe.
Comey and his wife were tracked by Secret Service following the seashell post last year, a step that's usually reserved for serious threats. And Comey sat for an interview, but DOJ took no further action until now. Comey responding to the indictment in a brief video this afternoon.
Nothing has changed with me. I'm still innocent. I'm still not afraid. And I still believe in the independent federal judiciary, so let's go.
And he spoke out on the actual post last year, saying he never intended for violence.
We stood over it, and I said, I think it's some kind of political message. And she said, 86, when I was a server, she did a lot of work in restaurants, meant to remove an item from the menu when you ran out of ingredients. And I said, well, to me, as a kid, it always meant to leave a place, to ditch a place. I said, that's really clever. So then she said, you should take a picture of that. And I did. And I posted it on my Instagram account and thought nothing more of it until I heard through her that people were saying it was some sort of a call for assassination, which is crazy. But I took it down. Even if I think it's crazy, I don't want to be associated with violence of any kind.
And joining me now to examine all of this is James Sample, constitutional law professor at Hofstra University, and Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney and MS Now legal contributor. It is great to have both of you. Joyce, so let's start with a question that Blanche essentially dodged at the presser earlier today, which is the crucial question here, how prosecutors are going to try to prove intent in this case. Comey, you hear him describe there, he immediately took this post down, very clearly stated that he had no violent intentions here. So how are prosecutors going to prove otherwise?
I think you've gone straight to the heart of the problem with the government's case here, which is that they will have to convince not just one person, not just a grand jury that hears only one side of the story, but a unanimous jury in a trial courtroom with a judge presiding that Jim Comey intended to kill or physically harm the president when he posted on Instagram. That feels like an insurmountable hurdle to me. The standard federal prosecutors use that we talk about all the time, Antonia, is the one that's found in the Justice Manual that says you shouldn't indict a case unless you really firmly believe you have sufficient evidence to convict and to have that conviction affirmed on appeal. The government does not have that there, and it was an unreasonable exercise of prosecutorial discretion to take this case to the grand jury.
So, James, if this is unreasonable, if there is an insurmountable hurdle here, what's the real point of this?
The real point is harassment. The real point is retribution. The point here is that we have two tracks at this point in our system of justice. And just in the last 3 weeks, we've had that encapsulated. 2 weeks ago, this same Department of Justice, led by this same acting attorney general, sought to vacate the convictions of the worst of the worst related to January 6th. The Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the seditious conspiracy charges. Those are the individuals who weren't covered by the full pardon given to the 1,500 plus individuals otherwise responsible for January 6th. Last week, we saw this same Department of Justice go after the Southern Poverty Law Center for infiltrating hate groups. And today, they decide to go after Jim Comey again, this time for a social media post. The message here is that Todd Blanche has an audience of one, and that is Donald Trump. It's not the rule of law. It's not what Joyce is referencing as the true and historic standards of the Department of Justice.
Joyce, what do you imagine? I mean, we heard Kash Patel at that same presser claim that there have been 9-10 months or so of investigation here. At one point, Blanche described the normal process to bring forward witnesses. I mean, implying that they're going to have an argument to make here around intent. And I guess I'm giving any shred of benefit of a doubt here, to the best of your ability. What can you imagine or your best informed guess? What does it look like as to what the federal government could have gathered here after trailing Comey with the Secret Service and allegedly investigating this over the course of the last year, which means there's overlap here between this case and the one that was previously tossed out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think James has the correct answer about this. This is not about convicting James Comey in a courtroom. This is about intimidating and harassing him. And of course, it's not lost on any of us, that Todd Blanche is currently the acting attorney general of the United States. He's auditioning for the top job. He wants to be the guy who gets to run the president's law firm, which is now seated on Pennsylvania Avenue in the Kennedy Building, where so many other people have served the American people. And it's really deeply disturbing. Unless the government has somehow acquired a smoking gun, Jim Comey writing in his diary or telling 3 reliable sources that when he posted that on Instagram, he wanted to see the president of the United States killed, the government didn't do any investigation in the last 10 months. And look, if they had a smoking gun like that, we would know about it because this Justice Department leaks, and they would have been singing that from the top of the mountains.
The other problem here, to me, it seems, is that this whole thing is built on the assumption that we all agree that 86 means to murder, to kill someone. If you have any friends who've ever worked in the restaurant business, it kind of means to get rid of, to toss out food, to not put an ingredient in somebody's order. It doesn't mean you are murdering the food. And so I guess to what extent does the technical definition, the sort of publicly held standard of an understanding of a term apply in this case, Joyce?
Yeah, this is why the government will be unable to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Comey had the necessary intent. I spent 4 years waiting tables. I know what 86 means. It means you're out of something and the chef has taken it off of the menu. Well, maybe other people use it in a more violent sense, but the jury will have to be persuaded that Comey didn't mean it in the more innocent application and that he intended to do violence. And that's completely out of keeping with Jim Comey's character. Anybody who worked with him when he was at either the FBI or the Justice Department is aware of his reputation and his effort to do the right thing, certainly not someone who ever called for violence. And so this is the kind of case where the defense will have character witness after character witness, and it doesn't really look like the government has anything to counter that.
James, I know you have something to say on this, too.
Well, Joyce said everything Joyce said is absolutely spot on. But let's get really legal here and technical just for a moment. The legal question here, the threshold legal question is 8647 a true threat? Now, that is a term of art in the meaning of First Amendment law. True threats are not protected speech. So that's an important question. And true threats against the president, there are statutes, and the statutes under which he was charged here are those statutes. That is a serious felony. The constitutional standard, though, for true threats in this context comes from a 2023 case. That's the most recent application of the true threat standard. And that case is called Counterman v. Colorado. Unless people think we're just talking about politics here, that decision was 7-2. Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Alito, and Justice Kavanaugh are in the majority. And as Joyce just noted, there is an objective component and a subjective component. And in order to prove their case, they're going to need to prove that this was objectively a true threat and subjectively that Jim Comey was at least recklessly disregarding of the idea that it could be perceived as a true threat. The idea that if this were ever to go to trial, which is its own threshold question whether that ever happens, that as Joyce said, they could get 12 jurors to unanimously convict on both elements of that is crazy. This is not a serious prosecution. It is a serious use of the Department of Justice for mispurposes.
And to be clear, statutes also prohibit the government from going after someone a second time just because their first attempt failed, right? That is...
Vindictive prosecution is a serious matter. I think there's a greater case here for vindictive prosecution than there is for the underlying offense.